Classical philology is not usually considered a font of social change, with its very detailed and rigorous look at the language and literature of ancient Greece and Rome. But our guest for this episode sees tremendous potential precisely in the careful work of philology to give us new avenues of civic engagement and social change, both in Africa and in the United States. David Van Schoor, a classicist from South Africa now teaching at Emory University, draws upon his wide and varied experiences both inside and outside academia to discuss what he calls Liberation Philology, the process of rediscovering the great works of classical antiquity, including the Bible, through deep engagement in the language of these works. This type of engagement can help us to free our minds to see our divided political and social worlds with new lenses that have the potential to break us free from our stalemates and renew civic and social relations. Hi, I'm your host, Steve Ahearne-Kroll, and this is the Future of the Past Lab, the podcast where we rethink the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. And I thought we would start with a little bit about your background. Can you tell us about your background, where you're from, your particular experiences that have shaped your outlook on classics and academia?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's great to be here. Well, I'm from South Africa, and specifically from Cape Town. And I was very much shaped by education first in junior school, a Catholic junior school, and then in an Anglican high school in a part of Cape Town called Rondebosch, and subsequently by my classic education at the University of Cape Town in the mid-1990s. And that was quite a distinctive and important time in the history of South Africa, because South Africa was not a free country until the early 90s, until 1992. So when I was in high school, Nelson Mandela had been released in 1989, and then it was a kind of transitional government from 1992, and our first democratic elections in 1994, which I just missed being qualifying to vote in because I was too young. And then I matriculated or graduated high school in 1995, and I was at quite a well-known elite kind of boarding school in Cape Town, mostly very prosperous white students, and that was a very unpleasant experience for me. White people in South Africa were very anxious about the onset of democracy, and I think this played out in kind of the life of schoolboys at the time in ways that were undesirable for me as a kind of outsider at that school. Yeah, so that led to me, that experience of school, but also of university. I've only realized this in the last few years, led to me being very ambivalent about classics. I mean, I was drawn to classics because I liked learning languages and because I was just mostly interested in poetry. And I thought, well, if you're interested in poetry, you should start at the beginning, which is for people living in a Western tradition, Western Christian tradition, such as I was, begins in Greece and Rome. I thought, well, that's what I should study, along with a couple of modern languages. But then I only realized in the last few years of my life that I left university after my 4-year bachelor degree very uneasy about the choice of classics, because of certain lecturers that I had openly who did not share my feelings about things, and who I felt I was very unhappy with. So that made me feel ambivalent about the discipline, but not about the material. I've never been ambivalent about the material, which I discovered as a teenager at high school. I found books in the library. I really liked Shelley when I was a teenager. And he wrote Prometheus Unbound. So I thought, and I read that it was based on an ancient Greek play called Prometheus Bound. So I thought, I should read that. And I was blown away by that. And then nearby on the shelf to that at my school library were dialogues of Plato. And I read that, and again, I was really struck by that. I thought, whoa, and then I found out about pre-Socratic philosophy, and then Sophocles. So those are the things that I love about the discipline, but there's a lot of stuff around that, so kind of institutional culture and the attitudes of people who maybe are in the discipline, which I found very alienating.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of contrast that you have, that you love the material so much, but you were turned off by the culture around the academic study of classics. So how did you come to grips with that in terms of going forward with your career at the advanced level? And how do you feel like you are, countering that in your own career now?
Well, actually, I fled from, to begin with, I fled from that. I went to live in Japan and for 3 years after my undergraduate study. And in Japan, in Tokyo, they have wonderful bookshops where you could buy Oxford classical texts of Loeb editions. And I found myself buying all of these editions because I could afford things for the first time. I had quite a good job. And I was quite struck how, it was like something I couldn't shake because part of me had tried to escape South Africa and basically the West. And I thought I was never going to go back to South Africa. I wanted to live a kind of rambling, roving life and just see the world. And then I was invited back to, it didn't work for me after 3 years, I thought I needed a change. And I was invited back to teach at the University of Cape Town. And then that turned out to be just a short appointment. And then I was offered what I'm trying to convey is that I've kind of stumbled into this career.
Yeah, yeah.
It feels almost like something that not, there's something of haphazard about the way I've just moved from one appointment to the next and from one level to the next level. I think I've been very lucky. I feel very privileged and very fortunate to have the job that I do. But there's an element of kind of hazard or happenstance to the way it all unfolded.
Yeah, that's very similar to, who in this world can predict what's, in academia can predict where they're going to end up? It's, the jobs are so few and you take what you can get. And, if you have this interest that you're passionate about, you just kind of go wherever that takes you in some ways. Yeah. I think that's not an uncommon experience to sort of find yourself in places you would never have guessed when you started out.
Yes, so, exactly. Yeah.
So can you talk about, there's a recent article that you and your co-authors wrote where you use this term liberation philology. And I was wondering, kind of thinking about your experience that we were just talking about, did this come out of your experience? Or, first of all, can you explain what that means and then how you came across this idea or developed this idea with your collaborators for this article?
Well, I was playing on the idea of liberation theology.
Yeah.
And I guess I have a complex relationship with Christianity and with Christian theology, which I feel like I'm an outsider to that, but I'm quite fascinated by Christians and by theology and by the textual culture, which I think is so brilliant, but which I think that Christians should enjoy more and pursue more and read more, their own great tradition of learning and study. So I try to apply the idea of philology for me represents the close reading and study of text as artifacts with historical reality. They don't just mean whatever you want them to mean, and one has quite a complex relationship with them. And it's a great kind of form of detective work, trying to engage with ancient texts and to get to their meanings as far as that is ever possible.
Yeah.
And what it often strikes me that we live in an age in which reading feels like a art that's being lost.
Yeah.
And that has a political dimension. The critical reading for which philology stands for me and in that article, which I would like people to practice and which I would like to practice, would make us less, in an ideal situation, would make us less gullible, less susceptible to being controlled by others or by political regimes of any kind. It wouldn't make us cynical in a vacuous way, the way that you also find. It would simply make us critical and make us demand high standards of proof and logic. And these are all things that I feel are missing in African cultural and political life.
Yeah.
Where you're much more apt to find articles of faith rather than, kind of critical inquiry. And people tend to go along with given ideas and ways of thinking. So I was trying to take the enthusiasm that I associate with those South American priests who practiced liberation theology and kind of claim it for a more intellectualized kind of relationship with ideas and with text. And kind of parlay that into a way of thinking about classics and reading of ancient texts, reading of Greek and Roman texts and Hebrew, whatever one can get one's hands on, as a kind of critical and ultimately political form of activity, which would be emancipatory.
Yeah, that's my previous position was in a seminary in the middle of Ohio, and a Methodist seminary, which was fairly politically progressive and theologically progressive place. But was a really strong anti-intellectual strain in that context as well, and people bristled at working too hard to understand the text, the biblical text, and that was really sad. But I think it also has a great potential for getting people out of their sort of slogan Christianity into a more robust, full understanding where you can't just say one thing and run with it. You have to say, well, what about this other thing? And what about this other thing? And it becomes a much more complex process as a result.
Yeah, totally. That's exactly, your experience at that seminary is very similar to, it sounds like, to many of the experiences I've had and the thoughts that I've had. I think that it would be a great, service that we could do as scholars and as readers, professional readers, if we could make people more articulate about their beliefs. I don't consider myself Christian at all. I find Christians fascinating. I also find them very often very irritating and hypocritical. But Christianity is a very beautiful thing. And I think its beauty should be better articulated by the practices of Christianity and defended better by them. And if I can help them with that, I'd like to.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a condescending way.
Right.
And I don't mean to say that people who have faith I hope it never comes across in this interview that I have any kind of feelings of superiority to people who do believe, because I don't feel that way at all. But I'd like a more, as you were saying, a more robustly kind of thoughtful forms of all cultural life, whether it's like religious, social, political. And I feel like there's not much I have to offer the world, but if there's one small thing I could do, I'd like to contribute to just raising the level of, articulacy about depth, as Charles Taylor puts it, articulacy about depth. So, and one more thing, when I came from a very devout Catholic family, and I was a very devout little boy. And when I was at junior school, around the time when I started to feel less devout, I remember asking a deacon who was one of the teachers in our school, Mr. Bruce, he was a good man, about doubt. And he said, I said, is it a sin to have doubt? And he said, no, not at all. That God had endowed human beings with mind and with intellect. And Mr. Bruce encouraged us, the class, to doubt and think about faith. And I thought, well, whatever one says against the Catholic Church, or might want to say, if that's their position, that's a very strong and self-confident position. You don't necessarily find that in all religious traditions, is the impression I get. But to say to people, yeah, really, go off and out, have a mindful relationship with faith. I was very impressed by that, and that really marked me.
Yeah, I always used to tell my students in my previous position that the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty.
Yeah, that's great.
Because, because the certainty, the whole life of any religion is one of uncertainty. Whether you have faith or doubt, it's all part of that uncertainty constellation, and it's a constant search for answers, and that's the way it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be, I figured everything out and I don't have to think about this stuff anymore. So
yes.
Mr. Bruce was a good man.
Yeah, he sure was.
So let's shift gears a little bit to what you've sort of outlined as a project in this article, which was a great article. You are advocating for sort of a re-examination of, for instance, like creating a myriad of new versions of the Republic, Plato's Republic, in an African context. But the reason isn't just to study it for posterity or for, intellectual growth or anything, but that it's key to what you think is to sustain political freedom and civic creativity. So that really struck me as a really interesting idea to go back to these classical texts for a contemporary context to try to recreate and reinvigorate contemporary society. And we've kind of touched upon this, but I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit more, this tension between, not just the elitism of classical scholarship culture, but also Plato's Republic was not a popular level work. It was a very high level philosophical work in ancient Greece. So how do you grapple with this idea of going back to such elitist texts as well to then use them in a way that is not just for elite populations in the contemporary world, but, trying to reinvigorate all levels of society and at the basis of culture and political activity and civic activity?
Yes. Well, I've often thought about the idea and the problem of agency in Africa, how certain political forms continue to survive, by which, for example, I mean the nation state, as conceived by Europeans and transplanted to colonial Africa. And even beyond liberation, Africa is divided into the often nonsensical units, these nation states. And Africa is such a vast place with 1,000 different languages, but its differences are always its internal differences are typically elided, and all Africans are simply black, considered not only by outsiders but by Africans themselves as forming a single kind of person. And to me, it's kind of bracingly exciting to think that nothing is actually fixed, that we could reestablish the forms of political life we enjoy in any situation, at any time. Yeah. We have the agency to reimagine how we live and how we constitute ourselves as political units. And for me, a very strong part of that this is very evident through reading certain books and thinking of Plato, for example, in his work in the Republic and in the Laws, just imagining, however serious or ironic he is being, just the act of imagining what the best form of the polity would be.
Yeah.
To me, that's so radical and brilliant. That's like human agency at its best. And I'm not a complete believer. I mean, I'm not a simple believer in human agency. I don't think we could do whatever we think we set our minds to. There are strong limits on ourselves, but that shouldn't stop us. Those limits shouldn't stop us from trying to do the impossible. Thomas Brown says, certum est quia impossibile. I think, yes, that should be the motto for Africa. It's certain because it's completely impossible. So what I was imagining in writing that article was like an African world in which not just Plato, but Thomas Hobbes or Machiavelli or Sun Tzu or Confucius or Sanskrit literature, and along with African thought, where all of that formed like the basis of a rich and constant and endless bustling dialogue about what kind of world we want to live in, what kind of continent we could make. Because there's a strong sense I've always felt in Africa of fatalism often and passivity. I was actually once chided by someone in a restaurant and a university intellectual because I was at the time I was visiting South Africa from Switzerland, and I was thinking a lot about agency, which is a central idea in my PhD. I was in my PhD, and I was reading a lot of kind of philosophical discussions of agency. And so it was very much in my mind. And I said to this person, whom I didn't know well, but I thought she was always well disposed to me and friendly. And I said, oh, well, she said something like, that the historical structures that have been laid down by the West and by people in the Northern Hemisphere, they're immovable. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. And there's no way of getting beyond that. And I responded, I try to be warm and friendly. I said, yeah, but don't you think we do have possibilities? We do have agency, that we can make the world in the image of our own minds if we choose to. It's that we're not completely fated by social or political structures or by the history of colonialism or slavery or whatever it is. That we could just look forward and not backwards. I think, what are
Yeah.
we going to do now? What great thing are we going to do now? And she was very hostile to me for saying that.
Hmm.
She thought basically that I was insulting her and that I was demeaning the history of struggle in Africa. And her and the dean who was sitting next to her said that I needed to learn a thing or two about colonialism. And I was very struck by how things are immovable because people kind of believe they're immovable and they want them to stay that way for some reason. And there was no way that if I said in that situation, yeah, we should read Plato more, that those guys, yeah, cool, that those guys that would only confirm their opinion of me as
Yeah.
someone thoroughly with a thoroughly colonized mind,
Right. Right.
who didn't value local traditions and the authentic, which is a concept I have a real problem with the authentic in Africa.
Right.
It's a tyrannical idea which holds people back. What's wrong with being inauthentic?
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking about this will kind of segue into the next topic, but I'm thinking about just not even that long ago, United States presidents ago, where you've got somebody like Barack Obama in office who is very well educated and also very curious while he's in office. And so he knows the history of our country. He knows the intellectual history of government and of the military and so forth. And then fast forward a couple of presidents to what we have now, to somebody who has no interest whatsoever in that great tradition and envisioning the future based on that tradition. And so what you're articulating here about appealing to the great works of both the Western and the African tradition to envision our future is really, predicated on politicians and leaders being interested in even learning about that tradition. And there are fewer and fewer people, it seems, that are really interested in doing that. And that's really sad, first of all, but it's also put us at a crossroads about where we're going, not just as a nation, but as a world, when you have people in charge that don't respect that process of learning and the humbling process of learning that tradition.
Yeah, well, the word humbling is the key point. I mean, is one of the main words I take from what you just said. That it is very humbling to look over a long span of history and to engage. I mean, to me, I'll never get over how we can still engage through the magic of the alphabet with minds that belong to bodies so long dead, and brilliant minds. Because we tend to think everything is getting better and more sophisticated
Yeah.
because of technology. But I think I get the impression that a lot of the most intelligent people lived and died quite a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's very humbling to be exposed to like the work of Aristotle or to the figure of Socrates and to kind of the thoughtfulness of Seneca, for example. All of that. And I shouldn't say even, but to the Bible as well. The book of Genesis, which I've been working on quite a lot lately. I just keep thinking what a miraculous work that is and how very humbling it is. And the more you kind of consume those works, the more you need them and want them. And the more you're humbled, the more you're humbled.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's a kind of
exactly.
circle. And it's a pity that certainly in public life in Africa, the quality of person seems very degraded from what it used to be. I mean, Nelson Mandela was a thoughtful and highly literate person, but the people who followed him in South Africa are very disappointing and just embarrassing. Africa could really do with a lot more reading and engagement
Yeah.
with ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. You also use this term, and one more thing on this line of thought, and then we can move on to something else. But you use this term pre-colonizing of the African mind. Is this what you're getting at when we were just talking about this? This sort of, well, tell me what you think before I butcher what you think.
I wrote that article 4 years ago. So in preparation for this, I was going back through my notes and I was remembering I'm very interested in Freud. And he initially referred to one kind of part of the human psyche as the pre-conscious. from which the id, which what later became the unconscious, which later he described as the id, is kind of terminally inaccessible to the conscious mind for Freud. But there's this kind of intermediate space from which memories and past experiences, perhaps maybe suppressed experiences, are in fact retrievable. And he calls that the preconscious. And I thought, so he's using pre, which has a temporal sense for us, almost in a topographic sense. And I was recalling how that's what I had in mind, this idea of pre-colonizing the African mind. So first I was thinking about Freud, and I was thinking about some kind of zone of African intellectual life, or some kind of repository of values which was accessible, from which we could retrieve things of value. But also the idea of pre-colonizing was intended as a kind of polemical thrust against the idea of decolonization. So I should explain that, because many people will be very unhappy with hearing that I'm against decolonization. That's not quite correct, but let me explain what I mean. So I've been saturated, I've been ruined by reading too much Greek tragedy in my life. And I tend to think of history, and I'm not the first or the only person like this, but I tend to think of history itself in terms of the dynamics of the Greek stage. And so when I think of African history, a lot of people believe in reparations and they want to recuperate what has been lost. And I very firmly believe that what has been lost historically is irrecuperable, irrecoverable in a literal way, but that some things can be retrieved from painful experiences.
Yeah.
So learning, for example, which is a very Aeschylean idea, that out of pathos comes mathos. So out of experience of suffering comes learning. And learning is much more valuable than anything else. It's much more valuable than, for example, in the case of reparations for slavery or getting something back because of colonialism. Much more valuable than simply, for example, just imagine Europe gave an African country 10 billion, 100 billion euros. That would be nothing compared to what we could draw from, and this is already available to us at any moment if we just spend time thinking and reading. The lessons about the nature of human life that we could draw from historical experience. And so the idea of decolonization doesn't make sense to me, because there's no turning back history. Africa has been completely transformed by colonization, by the violent collision with, rapacious European powers in the late 19th and early 20th century. There's no going back, and it feels, and I think no one really believes there's any going back, but it feels like a lot of the time I feel that a lot of African intellectuals and thinkers, and actually generally, they manifest the symptoms of being caught in a toxic relationship with some imaginary white other who has done them wrong, and they're going to reclaim some kind of authentic African selfhood. But there's no kind of authentic African identity that can be dissociated from the experience of that collision with Europe. So Africa has been westernized, has been Europeanized, has been Christianized. I mean, it's like 90% Christian and Muslim in the north. And so, like, Christianity is not something that belongs to Europe or to North America or to the Levant. It's as much an African thing as anything else. And to think of Africa as something isolated or isolatable from this history is a mistake. History can't be repealed and its laws can't be rescinded. And under those laws, Africa has been westernized. But it's been done so poorly and so partially that we have the worst of both worlds. We have, for example, the environmental degradation, which belongs to Europe and Asia and industrial economy. But we don't have the strong democratic institutions of Europe and the United States. So we have the bad of both worlds. So this idea of pre-colonizing was kind of going against the idea of decolonizing. It was trying to establish or articulate a sense of the tragic character of history and of African history, the irrecuperable nature of our loss, but the potential value in reflecting on loss as in some way potentially a gain. a gain in knowledge, a gain in resilience, a sense of our own strength in having endured and survived, you know. So if I could do one thing, it would in my life, I'd like to be able to kind of express how important it might be to get beyond what I see as the poisonous dialectic of colonial and decolonial, in a pattern in which I think a lot of people are trapped. And in that article and in that idea of pre-colonizing the African mind, I was trying to formulate a kind of escape route from this aphoretic pattern in which many people I feel are trapped.
Yeah, that's not what I was thinking you meant. So I'm really glad we we had this part of the conversation. So no, that's very helpful. So thinking about so you're now at Emory University and living in the American South in one of the major cities in the country, but definitely one of the major cities in the southern part of the country. What do you see as similarities and differences from your African past and South Africa in particular in terms of culture and education and whatever else you see that you want to compare?
It feels like home. Yeah, it feels like South Africa, like a softer, more benevolent form of South Africa in a way, because people are very polite here. Well, people are very friendly in South Africa too. I remember going through a phase in my early 20s of reading a lot of South American literature, and I was quite struck by how people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and lots of other South American writers, their favorite American writer was William Faulkner. And that they found themselves reflected somehow, or their experience reflected through his vision of the American South. I thought, I got to read Faulkner. And J.M. Coetzee, I may be wrong on this, but I think I remember that J.M. Coetzee felt the same way about Faulkner, as the most famous living South African writer. That makes sense to me as well, because just the structure of social relations here and the tone between people, it feels like South Africa where white and black live together. And obviously there's the history of tension, and there's quite an ugly history both here and in South Africa. But to a very large extent, we have got beyond the ugliness. Certainly, it's no longer lawful to exclude people and that's a big people. I think people underrate how important that is. That your rights are constitutionally protected, as they are in South Africa, as they are here, and so you're free to get on and make your life. And yeah, it's hard to it's hard to express, but it feels very familiar in that having that shadow of history, but then having a kind of the silver lining of the present in a way. And it feels like there's a bright future in Atlanta. Very cosmopolitan place, very dynamic economy. And for all my disappointments about the unachieved liberation that was promised in South Africa and other African countries, I still have great, hope for South Africa and for young people in South Africa, especially to create something really interesting and new. And I kind of feel that way about here too. It feels like an optimistic place.
That's interesting. What's fascinating for me about Atlanta and Georgia in particular or Georgia generally, is how important it is in American political life now, where in, just 15 years ago or so, it was assumed it was going to be another red state, another red area. I mean, Atlanta's always been fairly progressive, but not in its importance in determining national elections. And I mean, I imagine that has an invigorating effect on a city when, go from, not they weren't unimportant, but they weren't as important as they are now, 15 or 20 years ago. And just to, everything becomes much more sort of crucial in terms of like how the economy is and how education develops and how, race relations happen. All of that gets played out on the political field. And it must be an interesting place to be now, in general, but given your background, must be even more exciting to be there.
Yes. I quite like living in a state that's both red and blue. And I like the fact that I meet people who are, quite conservative and who probably think very differently to the way I think about the environment, for example, and politics, but who are polite and humane people. Yeah. And that's the kind of world that I want to live in, where you can completely disagree with people, but you can nonetheless get on with people and respectfully to talk with them. And I say this to my students at Emory, you guys are free to think whatever you want. You can be extremely left, you can be extremely right, You can be racist, I told them, if you want, if that's you think. But the thing is, you've got to bring data and you've got to be able to argue your case. And because I really believe in the data, that in critical engagement, that's what will change people. Not just simply saying that a priori you are wrong, but like saying let's talk and engage. And I like that about America. That I know a lot of people maybe at the moment are a little bit down on things politically, but as a newly arrived, I've only been here 2 years, kind of outsider who has a special kind of access to the country because I'm also English speaking. It's maybe it's just the effect of being an immigrant, but I feel it's a place of hope. And you just said I think we should take a longue durée picture of the past. We should take a longue durée picture of the future. And, it's early days in the history of the American Republic, and pretty much all the American people I meet are great people. And if the future depends on them, it's probably going to be a future that worth being a part of.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like Georgia from that point of view too. That you get all kinds politically and in every sense. I certainly wouldn't want to be in an environment where everybody just agreed with me or like shared the same point of view. I like being, and that also comes from being South African, where in my experience, a lot of white South Africans are, especially a few decades ago, were very conservative, very racist. And you'll meet people today with, I'll meet people with whom I don't agree, but I can still get along with them. And I think that makes the world richer.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, but I always like to ask the last question of our guests about your insights for all the grad students and recent PhDs who are struggling to find their way in academia. Do you have any advice or thoughts for them?
Yes, I think they should be fixated on publishing books and just treat that as the kind of sine qua non, that they should focus on that. Because it's become clear to me that that's all that. Maybe it's not true of all universities in America, but like in South Africa, the big thing was articles. But here it's books. And if you want to get ahead, just write a book and then write another book. But also, more importantly, classics is kind of a vocation. One does it because one believes in the value of reading and sharing one's readings and the value of kind of visiting the ancient past. And sometimes it's possible to lose sight of that, of one's, and that happened to me, as I was describing earlier. After I finished my 4-year bachelor's degree, I kind of became quite disenchanted. And even after my PhD, I started wondering, I started counting the years to when I might retire.
Yeah.
When I was back in South Africa. And then I thought like I needed a change, and I applied for various fellowships and jobs, and I think I got lucky. I got welcomed to the United States, and I feel very, very kind of blessed and lucky in that. But in my life, I have failed so many times to get things that I've tried for, to get published or to get accepted at conferences. So my main advice would be just to you can be disenchanted sometimes, but just keep trying, just keep pushing. And it's possible that you won't make it. Of course, you've got to keep that in mind. But it's also possible that you will.
Yeah, yeah.
And good luck to them. They're the future of the discipline.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights about this field and about a lot of other things as well.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege that you are interested to share my ideas. I'm very thankful.
This has been a production of the Future of the Past Lab at the University of Minnesota's Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Cultures. Our recording engineer is Jonathan Prestrud at the College of Liberal Arts Language Center at the University of Minnesota. Visit futureofthepastlab.com to learn more about how we are rethinking the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. If you wish to support this podcast and the work of the Future of the Past Lab, click on the donate button on our website.